Put your hand on top of your head.
Well,
Now!
And I'll bet your mother had a loud bark.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Jordan. I am the host of your show today, Morning Coffee with the Chief. I'm retired law enforcement. On this show, on this podcast, we look at a movie and I bring on some great guests and we discuss the movie. And the movie today we're going to do is The Taking of Pelham 123, the original. But before I get into that, I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects is the LA Mission. You know, the LA Mission is coming up on Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving is one of their biggest outreach days. So what they do is they start collecting money in fall. It takes about $500,000 to put on the Thanksgiving festival or the Thanksgiving celebration, which is a day before Thanksgiving. So they put it on and they bring in the homeless from Skid Row and they offer them services. And it really is, in addition to doing a good thing for your common man who is out on the street, the homeless, it is also a tool to bring them in, to give them services. And the LA Mission, they provide a ton of services, but one of the most important things that they provide is the thing called cognitive behavioral therapy programs. And so what that means is when somebody is ready to get off the street, what they really need to do is change how they conduct themselves, how they act. And cognitive behavioral therapy programs is the gold standard for that kind of behavior. You don't just throw them in a house and give them services. You have to get them in a long-term program. And the LA Mission offers that. And Thanksgiving and Christmas, these big events are a chance to reach out to them and convince people to come in off the street and reintegrate back into society. And I want to tell you, I've been talking about cognitive behavioral therapy programs and criminogenic factors on this show and other shows that I've been on for a long time. And I was listening to the Daily Wire, which is kind of a conservative broadcast, and I heard Ben Shapiro mention cognitive behavioral therapy programs. First time I ever heard any other commentator talk about it. And he, of course, said what I said. It's the gold standards, what you really need to turn people around. But the LA Mission has been doing this for a long time. They've been in place for 85 years. They come from a spiritual background, meaning they believe in God. And so they don't get any money from government. So they really depend upon you to make donations. So go to the losangelesmission.org, make a donation of $25, $50, $100. Your donation will go far and will help to get some people off the streets. And if they're not ready to come off the street, it gives them some basic services so they can survive until they are ready to get off the streets. So again, go to the losangelesmission.org and make a donation today. They're prepping for Thanksgiving. They really need your support. So let's get into the movie here. And I wanted to bring up my guest. Oh, wait a minute. I want to tell you, I was traveling recently and I just got back yesterday. And I know this show is Pop Culture Minefield on YouTube. And so I needed to talk about a couple pop culture icons that I saw yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days. I was at the hotel. I was in Colorado visiting my girlfriend, or not my girlfriend, my daughter and my granddaughters. And Jamie Farr from MASH was sitting right across from me, 4 feet, and so was Bob Eubanks. So the Newlywed Game host, and then Jamie Farr from MASH, two icons in pop culture. And so it was very interesting. They had a Comic-Con conference there. I was unaware of it when I booked this hotel, and so all these folks were running around the hotel. I didn't know who these guys were, but I did recognize these guys. So it was a great experience. Jamie Farr and Bob Eubanks. So let's get into our show though today. And one of the things I really wanted to talk about on this show is, there are some great movies that were produced decades ago. And this movie, The Taking of Pelham 123, was recommended to me by one of my guests. And I remembered the movie. I've been involved in transit policing for years. One of my guests has been involved in transit policing for decades. And then another guest grew up in New York. So let's bring up the Chief Ralph Ornelas first. He grew up in New York. He's got a long background in law enforcement. He can certainly add his experience of growing up in the 60s and 70s in New York. Ralph is a retired chief from Westminster Police Department, but he also is a retired commander from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. He has an expertise in narcotics and gangs, and he'll add some realism and some personal comments about riding the transit system in New York. Good morning, Ralph. Thank you for coming on my show.
Hey, Pat, it's great being on your show again. I enjoyed it immensely, and thanks for calling me up again, inviting me.
Now, you told me that you watched the movie for a third time last night with your 93-year-old grandmother. Is that correct?
No, my mother-in-law,
Your mother-in-law.
and
Is she a New Yorker?
she grew up in the Bronx, and we would watch it again last night and reminiscing about traveling the subway, the trains, and stuff. And actually, I got to share this: is that her father, Arminio Lombardi, worked as one of the guys checking your tickets and going in, had the cat on and stuff. And that's what he did for a living, and right coming from Italy,
Yeah, I like say that name again. I love the name.
Arminio Lombardi.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on the show. I know it's going to be a fun show. I know I do get into some serious subjects, and we will today a little bit of that. But I definitely want to have fun with the film because the film, in addition to being an action drama, is kind of a fun film, right? And let's bring up our second guest, Dr. John Sullivan. He's been on before. And Dr. Sullivan is a retired lieutenant from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. He's clearly an academic. He wrote an article about the taking of what Pelham 123 for the Chiefs of Police Association. John, you're on mute, so you want to unmute. And he recommended this movie. I asked him, I go, okay, which one you want to do, the original or the remake? He says, oh, I want to do the original. So, John, welcome to the show, and thank you for recommending this movie.
Well, thank you, Pat. The movie, like Ralph, the movie for me brings back memories of New York in the 70s, and it hit it dead on to what it felt like riding the subway in those areas. In fact, I rode that line for many years, from high school through graduate school. It was wonderful. And I think I had a very, very interesting presentation. I know we'll talk about it. One of the things I'll point out is I actually worked, my first job was with the New York City Transit Police Department as a civilian in the Juvenile Crime Prevention Unit, working on a delinquency diversion program at Times Square, 7th Avenue. I later on worked for the Transit Authority in the Car Equipment Department, looking at anti-graffiti issues in the 80s. And then I moved over in the late 80s to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. I worked in the Port Authority Police Division, as well as PATH, the commuter railroad from New Jersey into New York. So I have a bit of an understanding. And as you know, when I came to the Sheriff's Department, I got assigned to the Metro Blue Line Planning Project, which became the Transit Services Bureau, which you ultimately commanded. And I was assigned there 3 separate times, also assigned to Metrolink when they started up. So I have a kind of an interesting background, but beyond the transit police experience and my practical experience as a sergeant, lieutenant, watch commander with LA Sheriff, I've done a lot of academic research into this area. And I'll just point out a couple things. I did my master's thesis in 1986 on the consolidation of the potential, at that time, consolidation of the New York City Transit Police Department with NYPD. That merger actually occurred in 1995. So I have a little background there. I co-authored a book, Police and Transportation Facilities. I co-authored a National Academy of Science study back in 1998 on emergency preparedness for transit terrorism. So that's going to be salient here. And then I did write an article, Transit Terrorism Beyond Pelham 123, in 1996 that was reprinted in 2018 by the IACP for their 125th anniversary. So I'll talk about some of these things from a pracademic perspective, somebody who is an academic and a practitioner, which I think.
Okay, John, IACP, please tell our audience what that is.
International Association of Chiefs of Police. It's a
there we go.
global police chief organization. does a lot of research into these areas, and from time to time, they looked at transit terrorism. I found it really gratifying to see that article I co-authored many years ago got selected as one of their top articles over their 125 years. And I think that speaks not only, obviously, to not just myself and my co-author, but it speaks to the importance of the issue of transit terrorism, which we're going to dive into now.
Yeah, I think, and thanks, John, for telling the folks. I was the transit chief of police for the LA Metro. At the time I left, we had about 900 people doing that, and we still have a piece of that contract. It was always a lot of competition between LAPD and us as to who would do it. But when we did it, we reduced crime. We did a great job reducing crime. It was the lowest it had ever been, and until LAPD got back in, and it's way back up again. But I won't blame them, because this is there's a lot of social factors that are restricting law enforcement from doing their job. And I just want to, our audience, first of all, a lot of our audience is saying that this is a fantastic movie. It is a fantastic movie. I'm going to get into a little bit here, but I just want to point out that I don't just bring on pretty faces here. I have some really smart folks on that come on and talk about these movies in real life, what they mean in real life, but also about the fun aspects of the movies, particularly this one. But this movie was released in 1974. It's the taking of Pelham 123. It was directed by John Sargent. It's a crime drama, and it starred Walter Matthau, which I loved him as an actor. I know he was in My Three Sons, but he was in a lot of other things too. And Robert Shaw. Now, most people will probably remember Robert Shaw from Jaws. He was Quint, and he got eaten by the shark, right? And then we got Martin Balsam. Now, I completely forgot about Martin Balsam as an actor, but he was a good actor in his age. And Hector Elizondo. How do you say that again?
Hector Elizondo.
And I remember him from movies too. And he's a lot of really good, solid actors in this movie, and some that I recognized. I couldn't remember their names. There's a police lieutenant, and we'll get into it. He's on the street, and there's no need to salute. Remember that scene? I love that guy. I can't remember his name now, but we'll get into that. But so the premise of this show is these terrorists, for the lack of a better word, who are really robbery suspects. And this kind of reminded me of Die Hard 2. Die Hard, they're acting like they're terrorists, but really they were just thieves trying to steal stuff, right? And the original Die Hard, and that's what's going on here. They're just trying to steal. They take a transit train, and they hold people hostage for money, right? So we'll get into that a little bit more, but I did want to talk about New York City in the 70s. I wanted to talk about the transit system. So, I wrote down as one of my notes, oldest transit system in the country. I think you guys are even older than Boston's transit system, right? And it is the lifeblood for the city, right, Ralph?
Absolutely. I mean, you got about 12 million people. I could be wrong, in New York City, and you mentioned it in the beginning. People that, like my mom and dad, or my grandparents, or my mother-in-law's parents, and to get around, they didn't have money for cars. They counted on the subway system, the railroad systems, and the buses. But the subways were huge. When I was growing up, going from Greenpoint, Brooklyn to downtown to get the ferry, John, you remember this. It wasn't the Verrazano Bridge was built then. I would take, the subway system down from Greenpoint, Brooklyn to downtown, and then take the ferry across to Staten Island to see my aunt, and it was a great experience. And, I loved, as John said before we went on air, I loved going running. My mom used to chase me, and I used to love running from car to car. And they allowed you to go through that to the cars. Remember, John?
Yeah.
You could do that back then. They didn't want you to do it, but there was really nobody stopping you, and, it's just it was a fabulous experience growing up as a young man, a young boy at that juncture in my life, and great memories. There were some ugly things too. And I'll tell you a story right now. My grandfather, Ralph Ornelas, who was Mexican, he was on a subway going home. My dad and I dropped him off at Jamaica subway station. He gets on it, and he gets robbed by two guys. He was like 60-something years old. They punched him out. They broke his nose and stuff. And, even so back in, in the 70s, early 70s, there was still some crime and violence at that time. And I remember they took his watch, and I remember it was very impactful to me, the fact that why I think, I wanted to become a cop, to prevent some of those things that happen in older people. on these subways and trains. So, it was a great learning thing. I'll just share this last part. 1969, all my buddies were 13 years old, wanted to go to see the Mets play the World Series. We took the subway down, right? 13-year-olds, we caused havoc,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, but it was like there was something about the culture of New York. And what I love about this movie, and John, I know you're going to agree with me, it was the grittiness of capture, the director, capture of the language, the nuances, the certain things that even when you watch the movie, Walter Matthau was giving a tour of all these Japanese, executives from Japan on the subway, and even the languages used and the certain nuances, and even some of the derogatory comments he said about them, and later on he found out they understood English, but it captured the New York people,
Yep.
and I think that, and maybe people around the country didn't really appreciate it, but I know John and I, we kind of appreciate it because it made us who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, what were your comments? I mean, what do you think? Riding the subway in the 60s and 70s?
Well, riding the subway in the 60s and 70s was fascinating. I think the first time I actually remember riding the subway was going to the World's Fair in 1964. And I took I lived in Staten Island at that time. Took the ferry, got the number 1 train, went north to 42nd Street, and took the 7 train out to Queens, right across from Shea Stadium, where the World's Fair was. That's my first memory. Back then, that was prior to the graffiti and the disorder that later came in the latter part of the 60s, like 16, probably after 67, after the Newark riot. And there was a tumultuous, very turbulent time for NYPD in the late 60s into the 70s. In the 70s, right after this movie, graffiti became a major issue, and then as well as disorder on the subway. But right after the time this came, this is about the time this movie is probably the window at the end of John Lindsay's
Right.
term of mayor, and the subway started to get really treacherous. And for a period of time, they put a transit cop for New York City Transit Police Department on every subway train. Every train got a cop. And what impressed me, and I grew up there, was that the transit cops always worked one man, largely one man or one person.
One-person units.
One-person units. And that's key because they were able to help suppress crime. I became fascinated with transit policing by watching the transit cops, who I thought were like really consummate professionals, understood the public, knew how to get on there. And look, if you could control a train going to East New York on early mornings by yourself, you have some skills as a cop.
Hey, John, don't you relate it to is working a one-man module, in Men's Central Jail?
Yes.
That you have to use your mind, your mouth, and your heart.
Yeah.
And those transit cops, you're 100% right, John. I mean, but the difference is though now is the respect was there for law enforcement officers. It's not there anymore, John, and Pat. And that's a detriment. Even if they were on the train alone right now, maybe you disagree with me, John and Pat, but I would have really concerns as an executive of an organization having, John or Pat, a one-person unit on those subways right now, because I don't know if that would be a good time and place for that.
Well, I know I used to go on the transit system by myself occasionally as the chief, just to show that I was willing to do it, and because a lot of our guys wouldn't do it, and but you can get. I mean, I took an assistant sheriff. He wanted a tour. He hadn't been on. You remember Kavanaugh, right?
Yeah.
And our department had no clue about transit policing, and we go on and we get on one train, and somebody had robbed somebody, and we had to detain him. And I'm thinking, I'm holding on to this guy's arm. I'm in, my early 50s, and Kavanaugh, well, you know how old he was, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna have to fight this guy. I was so happy there was this really big sergeant who was carping on our system. He's like 6'6", and he saw us and he came over and took care of the guy. But then we went on another train, and this guy comes up to us and says, I'm being followed. And I'm going, oh no, I got another one. All in one a few hour session, and it was at that point that Assistant Sheriff Kavanaugh, because I was trying to convince them that we need to train in the environment, we need to do a lot of different things differently, and he got it. I did want to say one of our fans is saying Walter Matthau in Grumpy Old Men was good. He was very fantastic in that. I just wanted to say that to our fan. But yeah, so but I will bring up the political thing that we need to talk about today, and then we'll get into the movie.
Can I ask John a question though, Pat?
Sure, go ahead.
Because I brought up something about comparison years ago, John, about having an officer on each car in the subway. John, what is your belief today about what I mentioned, the lack of respect for police officers today? How do you think would that function today, John?
Well, that's a good question. And there is a general lack of respect for law enforcement among parts of the community. I'll point out that much of the community appreciates cops. I'll tell you, the poor folks that ride the train, New York, LA, and everywhere else, enjoy seeing cops out there. I think the way to deal with it, and we don't have, resources are hard. Getting cops on every train is hard, although you need to do train patrol. You can't police the transit system by car, right? You have to get out there. You have to do it. I personally believe you can do one-person patrols if you are in coordination with your sister units, and you let people know where you are and you talk and communicate. And part of that is letting people know where you are, looking at the surroundings inside the train, and patrolling as needed. If you need assistance, you call for it, you coordinate them in. When I first started my interest in transit policing, when I first went in 1978 and worked with the transit police in District 1, Times Square on 7th Avenue on the east side, they would tell me stories of before they had radios. They used to patrol the transit system without radios. They'd have the long stick, what they call the nightstick, and if they banged that thing on the ground 5 times in a row, that thing would echo, and that was the call for every cop to get there. So I think you can do it. I would call it proximity policing, where you have line of sight and you separate. I think one of the problems is a lot of cops like to bunch up because they feel it's safe.
Right.
And that's counterintuitive, though. For certain types of threats, like an IED threat, a bombing threat, an active shooter, bunching up is going to limit your tactical mobility. I think you can do it. I think it takes a degree of training. I think there's a need on many systems where disorder is rising to build the trust with the public, all of the public, and let the criminal element know that we are there. Pat, we were talking earlier. One of the concepts that came later in New York was the concept of broken windows. We often talk about Bill Bratton being chief of LAPD, commissioner of NYPD twice. He was chief of the New York City Transit Police Department in the early 1990s, and he latched on to the concept of broken windows, which was developed by James Q. Wilson at UCLA and
Keeling,
who worked a number of places. That concept worked. It's largely been misunderstood by some. There are some people who think that it's repressive. It's not. I don't think that was the original intent. I talked to Kellen at the Harvard executive session on policing in the 90s, and that wasn't the approach. The key, though, is if you allow disorder to grow, real crime follows.
Yep.
And I think that's a lesson. When we came back, I was on the planning team of the Metro Blue Line. We took a lot of those concepts that they were academically talking about at that time and put them to work. And for a period of time, the LA Metro, when the Sheriff's Department police had the best crime stats of any transit system in the country. That's not anymore.
Except that, having to gone to a lot of those meetings, let's just say they were very guarded about their stats and were not really inclined to release them, a lot of the transit agencies, and because it's very political, right? But I wanted to support what you said, John, by saying, hey, I found as the transit chief and as a transit professional for 10 years, the number one client I had were the transit dependent. As Ralph said, people who couldn't afford anywhere else. I never bought into the socialist notion that everything needs to be free for those people who can't afford it, because all that did was allow for disorder. You have to follow the rules. And if you're not going to follow the rules, then you need to be off the system, because the transit dependent, the people who have medical infirmants that don't allow them to drive, the people who don't have enough money to have a car, or people who, like, I'll tell you the story. There, we had a shooting up at Taft High School. You remember that shooting, John? And I talked to one of the kids who was a witness, big black kid. He took the blue line from South LA up to the red line, up to Ventura Boulevard line, and took that to Taft High School. It took him an hour and a half to get there. I said, well, why do you do that? He says, it's a better school. My mom wanted me to go to a better school. That's who our clients were. That's always who our clients were. And some of these people who have instilled the socialist notion of what law enforcement should be on a trans system have forgotten the people who need the trans system. Those are the ones who have the least. And all it did was disrupt their ability to get to work, to get to school safely and efficiently, which is where we're at now, both in LA, San Francisco, New York, and other transit systems. Go ahead, John. You can comment. We'll get a comment from Ralph. Then we got to get into our movie.
I'll just give you quick, because we can layer this over time. The important thing is you have to have security as a prerequisite to any political interaction. I can tell you, when I was in the latter part of my career, when I was a service area lieutenant for Blue Line, I would patrol, ride the train myself and get out there. And at that time, the public was not used to seeing cops on the train. They look at me and say, what's wrong? Why aren't there cops here? And this is an issue I think that came to play in LA. We didn't get cops on the train in the proper way. And I know that you supported that. I supported that. Not all of our peers did. You have to be there. You have to work with the public. The public likes cops. Criminals don't like cops. No. And the political arrangement of trying to change the equation. Look, there have been mispolicing, malpolicing incidents, but that's a leadership issue that can be addressed. But you need to have a healthy relationship between cops and the community. And on some systems, that's diminished, and that really needs to be returned. But I think that broken windows concept, if applied properly with equity, obviously you don't target people because of their race, ethnicity, social status. Everybody needs to be treated equally, but you have to protect the public. And
Ralph, what do you think?
Crime, but also for other threats.
I first of all, I'm an advocate for community policing. I did a lot of reading of Robert Tranowitz's books he wrote at Michigan State. Mm-hmm. I implemented it in Bellflower when I was brought in as a special assignment sergeant. And I agree with what you said, Pat, and John said. And being from New York, I'm a gregarious guy. I believe the public needs to interact, and the police have to interact with them, and the police have to get the butts out of the seat, the cars, and engage the public to show who John is, who Pat is, and who Ralph is. And that's what I was taught by my uncle and my dad about when they were cops in New York, about building your army, so-called. And so it saved my life. And I'll tell you, when the city manager of Bellflower brought me in as a sergeant, he says, we got to bring businesses back to Bellflower Boulevard. And I did a lot of reading and studying and communicating with Robert Tranowitz in Michigan State. And I followed his outline of his handbook. And we did everything that he wrote in there. And let me tell you, the crime went down. The deputies initially, and again, as lieutenants at Lakewood Station at the time didn't believe in me, but the captain did. And I'll tell you right now, we broke ground. We brought things, and we made the deputies break up the city and address the crimes and build a relationship with the community that got the information to solve those crimes. Well, now, last thing I'll say, I have a personal investment in the subway system in New York City right now. Yeah. My daughter lives in Brooklyn, and she travels from Williamsburg to Manhattan. So guess what?
Well, first of all, to support both of what you said, I did as I was working in transit policing, I decided to read the book The Turnaround by Bill Bratton. And for our audience, it's actually a fairly good read, fairly easy read, but it gives you an idea what he did in his day and what we actually did on the LA transit system. And many of the major transit systems followed that recipe to lower crime, and we moved away from it because of recrimination and accusations from people on the extreme left. I mean, and I lean right. I think John leans a little left of center, but we all realize what works, and good public policy is not bad politics. It's good politics, and somehow we lost that. I will say, as I visited some transit chiefs from New York, because we always fought keeping the deputies on the system, and I had probably a core of 35% deputies that absolutely loved transit policing. I still hear from them today. They loved it. It was their best assignment. Then I had a big group that did what they had to do because it was a good assignment, but would love to have been in a radio car somewhere else. But they didn't want to leave because it was still a good assignment, right? And then I had to deal with the 10% all the time, which is everybody has to do that. But this New York City Transit chief says to me, he goes, the corks. I go, corks? What are you talking about? Oh, because all the officers rise to the top, so we just call them corks, because they go up from the subway topside to see the girls and what's going on. So they call them corks, which I thought was pretty interesting. So we had a lot of the same challenges as chiefs of police for transit system around the country. It was keeping the guys and the gals on the line, focused, and a lot of our guys did a fantastic job. So I don't want people to come away with the fact that, the cops didn't do their work. They did good work. That's why we lowered crime. And I still hear from those guys today. So hey, Martine, let's get into our scene, the oldest system. I know we talked a little bit about this system, but John, one of the things I read about this is the mayor, Lindsay, did not want any graffiti showing on the system. He wanted a good, positive, best you can, depiction of the transit system. They didn't want to do this. They didn't want to think anybody. They didn't want to give anybody any ideas about taking over trains, right, and robbing trains. So they didn't really want that. As you guys said, this was pretty realistic, probably other than the graffiti. The graffiti had already hit there, but I did want to get a little bit in this. You guys touched on it. New York was on its knees financially at the time, right? And which makes the transit system that much more important, right? It's on its knees, and this is one of those things that allows commerce to happen inexpensively, right? So can you talk about the economics of New York at the time?
Well, Pat, I mean, I still remember the New York Daily News headline. Basically, president to New York dropped dead. They would, New York went bankrupt around that period of time in the 70s, and they sought support from the federal government and for bailout, and that never materialized. New York had a slowdown in the economy. I think there's a number of factors that came together for that, but I think that weakness, well, first it caused the city of New York still owns the New York City subway, but in the mid-70s, early to mid-70s, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, a state agency, came in to take control of the subway. The city was still part of it. I think they are there now. They're working on it. They're moving. But I think that economic slowdown combined with racial tensions, that those which exist now aren't new. They were very inflamed in the early 70s. If you look at the history of NYPD during that time, Foster and Laurie, two cops that got ambushed and killed, were present in everybody's mind. This order was coming, and people realized you needed to control the subway. And part of the reason that's why terrorists look for the subway. The subway is a place that every person who lives in the city can identify with, right? Everybody, particularly New York, which has a much larger transit system than we do here in LA, everybody knew that they rode the subway. They knew the smell of disorder. Right. They knew what people who were doing drugs and riding the subway and causing robberies and muggings. People knew that. So I think in some ways that's why terrorists go to transit, because it's something that everybody can understand, and it amplifies the impact of their attack.
So if and when you say everybody, that means if you were wealthy and you lived in Connecticut or you lived further out, you still had to do some kind of connector on the transit system to get to the commuter lines, right, Ralph? So you had to be on that subway on the New York system to get to those commuter lines. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know a lot of people from Long Island, Garden City, which John knows are pretty wealthy people, will take the Long Island Railroad into Penn Station and take the subways to go to some of the shows and everything. So everybody used it. And just to add to all about that time in the 70s, remember a lot of because of the budgets, if it was real or not real, John, there were a lot of NYPD leaving New York State. They were going to Texas, they were going other places and stuff.
Florida.
What's that?
A lot of them went to Florida.
Florida, and so they were losing a lot of police officers. And I think Lindsay, during the time in this movie and stuff, I think he was concerned about what John also brought up about is that it was an evolving of an eruption of violence. And, we had all the riots and stuff like that, after, Martin Luther King was killed. So there was a lot of still tension in New York City, and compounded with the fact of losing officers going to other states. I mean, the mayor and the commissioners at that time were concerned about safety, and so was the public, because we felt it. I mean, I think we felt it my time working in different jobs at the time when going to college, high school at the time, and going down and work in the loading docks, loading tractor trailers. I felt that stuff, the tension in there, and you could see it. The police were affected by it too.
Yeah. Well, you guys both know I'm from Detroit, so we had a lot of racial tensions in Detroit as well. So I can certainly understand. Hey, let's go into our next scene, Martin, and this is a train takeover. So in this scene, these guys come in and they end up filtering in on the train system, and they ended up doing the takeover. But I really wanted to get into, John, real life. We had some, I don't want to say they're train takeovers, but we did have situations where groups of guys would come in and rob everybody on a particular train car. To me, that's a train takeover because they take all their property. So these things do happen, but they happen in LA, and I'm confident they happened in New York in the 60s and 70s, and they probably are happening now. If you want to talk about just a garden variety train takeover that we might see today.
Well, Pat, I don't think train robberies or getting on the system and robbing people, I think that does occur. That's not the same as a hostage taking, which occurred here. I think you have the possibility of opportunistic crime getting in there. But you also have the potential, in this case, this hijacking was what I would call quasi-terrorism, or what in the 70s was referred to as quasi-terrorism, where people use terrorist means to, conduct normal criminal activity. I think that it's still possible, but I'll tell you one thing: hijackings were really one of the major forms of terrorism through the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s. If you think at that period of time, people would talk about hijacking planes to Cuba. In 1972, we had the Munich Olympics, and there was a hostage taking there. There was the 1976 Entebbe raid was addressing a hijacking, and on trains specific in 1975 and 77 in the Netherlands, the South Moluccan terrorists conducted two very notable train hijackings that became, understood in the counterterrorism world. I think the main threat to transit system from this type of activity, from terrorists as opposed to criminals, remain hijackings and bombings, because bombings were always there. I think as we move into the current, bombings have become a little more common than the hostage taking, but hostage taking still exists, still go. I think the key here, and this is something the British Transportation Police pointed out to me when I spoke with the chief constable back in the day and a number of the inspectors there. They found that cops actively patrolling the system to deal with regular crime actually had a deterrent effect for terrorism on the system.
Yeah.
And if a terrorist attack occurred, they were able to get cops and mobilize them and get them in there now. And if you think the one thing that I think is different now, hijackings back in the earlier days, bombings continue. Right now, we start to see active shooters layered on top of that.
Yeah, I think the casualty of security, or one of the casualties of efficiency and cost effectiveness is security, right? And and that's why transit, no matter where it is, whether it's trains going through the Old West and being robbed by the cowboys or whoever, is there an attractive target because they're used to carry people and money to and fro. And it's hard to have security at every point because it's designed to be incredibly efficient and effective. And if you add a layer of security, it reduces that efficiency and effectiveness. And which is why, probably New York struggled to have that security, right, Ralph? It's like you don't have the money. You can't put cops out there. That's why cops are leaving. You're not paying enough money. So the cops you do get are not necessarily the highest quality. So that's the challenge of New York in 1975, right?
I agree with your statement. I think, but I mean, I'll go to the future though. I think it comes down to even that back then there should have been better training about how you train officers working the subway system on the platforms, and body language. How do you read body language when you what are certain profiles? I don't believe we did enough back then. Even now, we need to teach our officers on the platforms, patrol cars. How do you identify some people? I mean, I know we could go, oh, it's profiling, but there's something to that, and the Israelis do it all the time. When I worked with some of the Israeli police, I mean, they do it all the time. And now we have such a negative connotation about assessment of people potential violence. But I'll just share this to you with John. John, you remember in the late 1980s on the Long Island Railroad when the guy at Maryland Station in Garden City took over the station and killed a number of people?
Yes, I do. In fact, I was at that time. I was very close in collaboration with the then Long Island Railroad Police, their chief, John O'Connor.
Yeah, yeah.
I went out there, worked with them several times. In fact, that shooting, I developed some recommendations that I actually presented to the Long Island Railroad Police. They ultimately merged with the Metro North Police, the other commuter rail system in New York, to become the State Metropolitan Transportation Authority Police. But yeah, absolutely.
Hey, John, can you remind me of that? I mean, I don't remember that was just a robbery, wasn't it?
Well, no, I think the actor, I don't think it was a robbery. I think the individual came in and started shooting people, and kind of probably the precursor to the active shooter issues we see now. Back in the day, we used to call it going postal. I think that was the first known mass shooting on a subway system.
Right.
We talked, one of the responses there, and it ties into things now, but something that's often misunderstood, is that on the Long Island Railroad and commuter railroads, they have conductors that back in the day would walk the train and get engaged. And
The
you talk
tickets.
indicators of seeing what's happening. If you can train your transit personnel to understand those, they can call in the transit police. Whether they're commuter railroad police or subway police, transit police have the ability to get there. But you also, I think, and we see it happening in some places, where people say cops are expensive.
Yeah.
And transit systems don't want to have cops, but they need to have cops. I think the one thing in this movie that they harped on is on-time performance. They didn't call it then that in the movie, but every time they were doing that, that was hyper realistic because they want to move the trains. They don't want to stop the trains. I can remember as a watch commander, I'd suspend service for a period of time for a threat, and I'd be asked, "Well, we need to move the trains. Can't you just pick the bomb dog up and put him on top of the ticket machine?" I'm like, "It don't work that way. We will clear it as soon as we can." But you have to coordinate and understand that they need to move trains. You need to operationally, you need to figure, can I close this part of the system to deal with the threat, or do I close the entire system? Right.
Pat, and John, going back to the movie, the gentleman, Kaz, who eventually walked down the railroad and got shot. I mean, that was his job as a supervisor. And then Frank in the command center was screaming all the time, exactly what you're saying, John. We got to meet the schedule. We got to meet the schedule. And
I will say that watching these guys, one of these Kaz reminded me of Dwayne Martin. I don't know, just get it moving. What's taking so long? You know what I'm talking about. And I always felt, God, if there were any group of people that could actually be cops, it's these guys that run these transit systems, because it's take no bull, get it moving, let's work. I did want to say one of our audience pointed out that, hey, they used to ride stagecoach, right? Trains were they followed stagecoach were the precursor, right? You couldn't protect them, but yeah. So I agree with you. These guys were. Let's go into our next scene. It's transit police. But one of the things, John, you talked about is the conductors and the engineers. And as the chief, I used to say, hey, you guys have this safety first model for all your safety issues. Guess what you need to have? Security first as well. Everybody has a role, and that includes the conductors, which we really didn't have on the train, but engineers, the custodians, whoever it is, even the administrators who rode the train system during the daytime and then would send me emails to tell me about stuff they saw. And I'd say, well, why didn't you tell me yesterday when this happened? Well, because they wanted to be an auditor. They didn't want to be part of the team. And I finally told the head of the trans system, it does me no good to get this 2 or 3 days later that we had a problem when they were on the train and could have gotten off and easily told us. Either they're part of the security system or they're part of the auditing system. And everybody needs to be part of the security system. Not everybody gets to be an auditor of the transit police, which is, and you know what, to his credit, God, I forget his name, but he said, hey, from now on, if you see something when you can safely report it. Don't send me an email a day or 2 days afterwards saying where were the cops, right? And that's an attitude that everybody has to say. But on this scene, it's the transit police scene. And I really wanted to get into, since you guys have the history, transit police was separate when you guys were riding in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? They were their own entity. You see the interplay. You can tell that there's a little bit of friction between the two, and one is kind of better than the other. I know I saw this, it happens with the New York City Fire Department and the police as well, the bravest versus the finest. There's always this little drama back and forth between the interage rivalries, and there was a little bit of rivalry between the transit police, we were separate, and the city cops, right? All right, John?
Yeah, there was rivalry. But by way of kind of background, initially the New York City subway were two private railroads and one city railroad: the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, or the BMT, the Interborough Rapid Transit, the IRT, and the Independent Subway, which was owned by the city, called the IND. In 1949, and initially they were policed by the New York City Police Department, NYPD. In 1949, they separated the transit function and created the New York City Transit Police Department, which was a mayoral agency, because at that time, the New York City Transit Authority was a city entity. There was rivalry between, transit cops and regular cops, housing cops. There was also a housing police department. There's always been a rivalry in New York between FDNY and the NYPD, although I think after 9/11, that common threat bonded people together. I think even here we have rivalry between the LA Sheriff, LAPD, and there was once the RTD, which became Rapid Transit District Police, which later became the Metropolitan Transit Police. I used to have some deputies look at the Amtrak Police, which also co-policed Union Station with us, and think we were better than them. I would counsel them and say, no, we're all cops. We all have a special mission. We need to work together. But I think that's realistic. But I think when it came down to it, cops are cops. They support each other. I think you saw in this movie, the development, they didn't call it that, and they didn't call it that back then. You saw the development of a unified command, right?
Yeah.
You have Mathau, Lieutenant Garber, being the effective incident commander, but coordinating with the Manhattan Borough Commander and the inspector up at the 28th Street station. And then you had, I like this, having once been an ops lieutenant, Jerry Stiller being the ops lieutenant.
Rico.
He was wonderful. He was realistic. That was back, in the day when New York City Transit Police ran out of J Street in Brooklyn. They've moved that, they've turned that building into something new. But I think it was realistic. But to tie back to something, Pat, because 1973 was when Colin Ferguson conducted that shooting on the Long Island Railroad. 1993 was another notable terrorist attack in New York, was the bombing the World Trade Center. And
the first one. Yeah.
The first time.
Which was not directed toward transit, but impacted path. And later on, the 9/11 attack impacted path in the New York City subway. They just recently finally reopened the last station after rebuilding that 20 years later. I think what we see is, and this goes to the question, as I mentioned to you before the game, before we went on the show, I wrote my master's thesis in 1986 on the consolidation or the merger of the 3 New York City police departments. It used to be you take the police test and then you would randomly get assigned to either NYPD, transit, or housing. And many people thought NYPD was the top of the hit parade, and they're a very solid entity. They have, you saw it in this movie, their emergency service unit, ESU, coming in to respond to that attack. But they worked together. I think what we see now, what I learned looking at it is economically consolidating the police brings some economy of consumption or economy of scale for providing logistical support. It does not necessarily provide better operational coordination, but it can. My determination was you could do both, but you need strong leadership to bring together the disparate agencies. Because look,
I can tell you, being the transit chief, one of the things I noticed when I went to transit is we were treated as second-class citizens even on our own department. Our own department looked down on us. So I know that there had to be some attitude there. And I know what my focus was is to harness the resources available and build effectiveness in terms of our counterterrorism effort. And I mean, we ended up having 23 motors, 13 dog teams, an anti-terrorism team. And as we begin to up our game on transit, and I started convincing other executives on the department that we really need to focus on the specialty of transit policing, we started getting attention from around the country on how well we were doing. And I noticed when Bratton talked about it, hey, we're not second-class citizens in his book. He pulled his resources back. He focused. He implemented the broken windows theory, and it was a game changer for NYPD on the subway system. Now, Ralph, did you ever get a chance? So you knew it in the 70s and 80s, and you probably went back to visit before Bratton hit. But let's say early 2000s. Did you get back to New York, and what was your experience on the transit system? Did you ride it? Yeah, I want to say like 5 or 10 years after Bratton implemented turnaround on the transit system. How'd you feel the difference?
I felt that Bratton did an excellent job in training and holding all his executives accountable. Every precinct, even the subway, when he took over everything, that when they merged, I thought it was a much more uniform department, more responsive department to crime. And remember something, Bratton, yes, he was the man. But remember the guy with the bowl hat? I can't remember his name. He came from transit services, John. You remember that?
Yes, I do. Jack.
So let me just finish my thought. Let me just finish my thought process. Was this? That guy was really the true idea man for Bratton to implement all the things that he did within NYPD as a commissioner, and then also Bratton took it out to LAPD. But something about training, I thought the greatest thing that happened to NYPD was merging all those departments. Why?
Yeah.
Because being a drill instructor at the LA County Sheriff's Academy for 5 years, I felt when we trained all the different agencies in LA County, we always talked about, we may have different patches on our shoulder, but we're all doing the same job. I think NYPD, because I have 2 nephews who went to NYPD, and I used to talk about this, and they said, Uncle Ralph, you're right. When they merged it, and when my nephews came on after that, they saw there was a more unison of team. But again, it goes back to what John says. It goes back to the executives. Are certain executives going to carry with them their certain mind frame about, well, I wasn't a transit person, but I was only working the 75th precinct, and this is how I feel. Well, you know something? That's where other executives above them have to change those executives' mindset about how you approach it, because you want to build everybody that, hey, we're at the same uniform, we're doing the job, the same job, in different spectrum, though. That's all.
Well, let me bring on the next scene, and we'll follow this discussion. It's called the Command Center, because I want to get your thoughts on this. But I did want to add, I said, once John was there, and he was my idea man. And once we improved the transit system and the transit police and how they saw the deputies who worked the transit system. I always get a call from some executive, hey, can you take so-and-so? He'd be a great sergeant on your special team this, or, can you put this guy on your special team that? And I'd say, yeah, after they work 6 months on the line. That was my attitude. It's like you have to pay your dues. You don't just get to parachute into these great jobs that we created, because, well, he has all this experience. Yeah, but he doesn't have any experience on the transit system, and he's got to show that he's willing to do that work before. And I tell you, once I did that, and people, because y'all remember this, once you're funneling through where you're doing the boots on the ground kind of stuff, before you get any other opportunities, and you show you're willing to do the dirty work, and then I gave you rewards, that kind of changed the mindset of a lot of the guys there. They saw that the guys who were doing the work were the ones who were getting the rewards, and all these guys who wanted to parachute and be part of the anti-terrorism team or have a bomb dog or get on a motor, they had to do the grunt work first. And I have to tell you, I think that one decision that I made doing that did more to turn around the trans system and to build respect amongst the guys who worked for us, because I was a ground pounder my whole career, and I'd watch these guys parachute into these great jobs. And it's like, hey man, you just spent 10 years at the Bureau. Now how about you do some grunt work again before you earn your way back up? Just because you got accepted to the Bureau or somewhere else doesn't mean you get a pass for your whole career. That's how I felt about it. But hey, I was a patrol guy. But on the command center here, John, I got to ask about the command center. How realistic is the command center? We see it in there. They have these little blinking lights, and they have these mics. They have a bunch of people there. It reminded me of Metro's, although Metro's was obviously updated. And I will say, one of the comments, because there is a lot of comic relief in this movie, they're talking to the hijackers, and you got your Dwayne Martin type there who's yelling, "Can I need my trains released?" I mean, and he says, "How do you run a train system without swearing?" Right?
Yeah.
Garber corrected the guy. "Stop swearing. We got a lady here. Bringing ladies here. How do you run a train system without swearing?" So talk to me about the train system and the attitude of these guys who run these systems.
Well, I got to tell you, I thought that train control facility was accurate for the time period, and metaphorically accurate now. I mean, obviously we have the ability with modern technology to have a more detailed understanding of where the trains are. Knowing, things are now digital as opposed to analog. Back in the day, they would have distributed control with a central control facility. Now computers make it easier. But I found having a real close relationship between the transit police.
Hold on, John. 1 second. Danny Regalado, being on the train is the most important part of transit policing. We all remember that name. Danny, thank you. Glad to join the show. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
No. And Danny and I worked together back on the Blue Line in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And again, he's a great deputy, and he understood the mission. And he's absolutely right. I think having the ability to have a close relationship between the police commander to watch, the watch commander, or what they would call in New York a tour commander, the operations lieutenant, as they showed in this movie, is essential. That system looked much like train control looked at that time period. On railroads, throughout the country, path system looked the same. The path police were right next door to their path control, central control facility. I think that's realistic. Having that dialogue is realistic. I think what we talked about it earlier, that emphasis on time performance, getting the trains moving, that is gold to the transit folks. And the reason it's gold, and I'll tie it back to the terrorist threat, is one of the reasons transit systems are vulnerable to terrorism is they have a wide range of targets. You can attack a train, you can attack a station, you can attack signals and switching, right? The terrorists can select which one of those they want to attack. They can choose their method of attack: bombing, active shooting, or hijacking, hostage taking. They can control the timing, right? We're going to give them the element of surprise because they understand. We know that the trains run on a schedule. You can look at the schedule and say, on the IRT Lexington Avenue line, the 6th train. This time of day, I can expect a train to come every 8 minutes, right? And then you can time your attack. The transit system gives a concentrated, predictable area and time frame for the terrorists to attack, or any criminal, right? You can plan your train robbery or mugging, knowing that you can grab the purse as the person gets on the train, run up the street and get out, and now you have to coordinate between street cops and the transit cops, right? And that is a seam. You can solve that with radio. You can solve that with working. I think the command and control there was very realistic.
The robberies became apple picking, which was the bane of my existence. Crime was going down, and then these iPhones came out, and these guys they would be on the phone, right by the door, talking on their phone, and just get plucked out of their hand. The guy is off and running, and my robbery thing started to climb. I'm like, it was driving me crazy. But it's exactly what you're talking about, John. And but it is a soft target. It can be solved by having cops on the line. But Ralph, I need to get into the attitude of the New Yorker who has to get something done, and whether you're a fan of Donald Trump or not, one of the things I noticed about him is a New York developer from Queens, right? And being a developer in New York, running a train system in New York, these are not for the faint of heart, right? These are people who are tough. They speak what they say, what they mean. They sometimes speak in colorful language, but it's about getting stuff done. And sometimes that's what you got to do in New York, right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I learned when I left New York in '79 to join the sheriff's department, my certain vernacular and language had to be changed because I don't think that Los Angeles people, they weren't receptive to that, and I had to turn down my bluntness and be a little bit more diplomatic because I think New York is, as you saw in this movie, Kaz and Frank and Garber and the guy who's a lieutenant above ground who's said, you don't have to friggin' salute, get the fuck down there, Well, guess what? That's what New Yorkers do. I mean, when I was growing up working on the loading docks, if you didn't, it was not normal not hearing F-bombs and you're not, somebody screaming at you, they'll call you all different derogatory names if they knew your ethnic background and stuff. But, but New York it's get the job done. It's like Kaz, when he was walking along the platform and he stepped down and he goes, I'm going to get this shit. This got to get back in. Well, you know something? That's what New Yorkers are about. I mean, New Yorkers just get the job done and let me do my job and, pay me what I'm worth. And, let's move on with life to the next challenge. But, I look at that whole coordination between the transit and NYPD.
Hey, Ralph, just a second. So Danny Regalado, again, thanks, Danny. Green Line 211 takeovers were a big problem until deputies decided to board the trains and took it personal. That's exactly right. I'm sorry, Ralph, but we got to get back also to, so the attitude, you agree that attitude is sometimes necessary in a big city like New York, right?
Absolutely. And that's how for years they got things done.
Yeah. And so,
hey, can I say one more thing? Because you talk about the personnel working number of months, years on the transit. I had a detective, I'm going to mention his name, a great man, Eric Arias. Eric Arias worked the transit services, right? I don't know how long he worked it, 3 years, I think. And then finally, he wanted to apply for OSS. And he really didn't go to patrol. But he came to us. Do you know he turned out to be an outstanding OSS investigator? And you know where he is right now? Homicide.
I had this guy, we put together the anti-graffiti team, and that's the only, it was the only award that I'm aware of that the LA County Sheriff's Department got from the International Chiefs of Peace Association for investigations. And we were killing the graffiti guys, not literally, but we were just ripping those guys up. They were afraid of us. We had a really good system. But the investigations those guys had to do to go after tagging crews was way more complicated than the rock that they got from the Rock House and Compton or wherever else. And I told my guys, I said, hey, just listen. I had been a detective, and I had a good guy named Louis Nunez, who was my detective sergeant, and I said, we're going to train you how to be detectives. Please just follow the blueprint. And when you're done here a couple of years, you can go interview at Narco or wherever you want to and drop a couple of your search warrants on them. And they'll be shocked because they'll recognize the hard work that you did just to take out a tagging crew. And a lot of those guys went on to really good work. But you had to teach them. I said, investigations is a skill set. It's not what you investigate. It's knowing the laws, how to use the laws, how to develop probable cause, how to do an affidavit, all those things. And you just let us guide you, and you will be able to. And I had guys, they're on majors, narcotics, they went to homicide, they went all over the place, but they started their investigative stuff doing tagging crews, right? And because I always said police work is police work anywhere. It's the terrain that can be different. But you can learn police work whether you're on a train system or you work in a suburban community or you work in an urban environment if you got good leaders and you listen to them. And a lot of those guys did, and they've done great, So, anyways, we got to move on. So the next one is it's time to talk to them. So our hijackers have now they've secured the train. They've separated the one car from the rest of the cars in the tracks. And John, I really wanted to get how they work. How does New York manage to work their way around all of this problem? So, because they were mad that they took down a line, but you're able to still work around some of these lines, and you could do bridging and that kind of things. But they did talk to them. They tell them this is a hijacking. Obviously, Garber and the rest of the police guys are now reacting to this. And our transit folks are really pissed off because now it's locking up the system. It is interconnected, but they are able to move around these things. Tell me, if one line is taken down, you can still move people around, right?
Well, yes, it depends on obviously where on the system it is. In this case, this would only take out the IRT Lexington Avenue line. That's like the 4, 5, and 6 trains in Manhattan run on the Lexington Avenue line, either local or express. So you would tie up that line, but there's other subway lines that are, the West Side IRT, the 1, 2, and 3 trains. The only place they kind of converge is south of where this would occur at South Ferry, where they have the loops for the trains to make the turnaround. The IND trains and the BMT trains are totally separate systems, but integrated within the same umbrella. Those would still run. You could provide, as I have done, and you've supervised bus bridges for the area closed. So you say this area is closed, we can't move a train here, we're going to move bus bridges. There would be a significant choke point. This IRT component where they were operating is part of the oldest part of the IRT, going back to like 1904.
IRT, John.
Interborough Rapid Transit.
There you go. Okay.
It's the IRT. There's 3 parts of the New York City subway: the Interborough Rapid Transit, the IRT, which they call the A division of, if I am correct, and then there's the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit and the Independent Subway IND, BMT and IND, which is the B division of the subway. Unless I've got it backwards, I believe that's it. Those were initially separate systems that have been merged together with connectivity over time. But you can't run the IND and BMT trains on an IRT track. The track width is the same, but the tunnels are smaller on the IRT. So you can run IRT trains on the other system, although the gap between the train and the platform's a little wider. But you could work around it. The key there is working around it. Requires close coordination between the transit professionals and the transit police, and obviously other supporting entities, the city police or the street police and the fire service, EMS service, because in this case you would need, fire EMS response to help extricate,
staging. Like yes. Well, so there are workarounds, and I don't know how many bus bridges or workarounds that we had to do when I was working on the transit system, and certainly the chief. I'm speeding up a little bit here, so guys, I want to go to the next scene. Roll in the next scene right after this one, Martin, and that's the ex-military, and So one of the characters, Robert Shaw, he gets called Colonel, right, which indicates that he's probably ex-military. And I have to tell you, I like to read, and I'm kind of a history buff, and stuff just kind of stays in my brain when I read, right? And I immediately thought of the ex-military mercenary Robert Denard, who's a French guy who was an ex-military, but in this one it implies it's British, and there's a couple of guys. I remember Simon Mann, Executive Outcomes in Africa, and Mike Hoare, I think is how they say his name. And so there were a lot of guys that came out of World War II and became mercenaries, which is what Robert Shaw is based upon, patterned on his behavior here is because he's ex-military looking for a big payoff. And so anyways, I don't know if either you guys have any knowledge of that and want to comment on that. I don't think it's realistic that they would get involved in a straight robbery like this, although they would loot a nation's treasury if they could. I think Simon Mann or Mike or one of those guys did that. Any comment, Ralph, on that that kind of stuff that was part of our world back in the 70s and early 80s?
I mean, in regards to the movie and this character Robert Shaw portrays, I believe his mentality was he feel like he got cheated being a mercenary out there and not getting his payday that he expected doing what he did, whatever country he was doing it in. And he felt this was an opportunity. And he must have somehow connected with Martin Balsam, who played Mr. Green. Yeah. And he convinced him that this would, he must have done his homework, his intel on Mr. Green, Martin Balsam, that he had all this knowledge, and he convinced him because he was obviously was a recalcitrant from the transit services and being a motorman probably. And he convinced him that this could be a huge payday for both of them. So, hey, listen, we probably see this in this day and age with regards to gang members, a law enforcement that leave as unhappy people who got fired and maybe flipped over and done things. I mean, we have let's face it, look, it's going over the border right now. And look in El Salvador when we had during the guerrillas in the 1970s and the 80s, we had guerrillas and military coming over. And remember, LAPD lost a couple of police officers in Los Angeles that were former military and guerrillas from El Salvador that killed our officers, So there's always going to be a mentality of somebody feeling cheated and is going to take advantage of something like this.
Yeah, I think the Zetas started out as more of a mercenary arm of one of the cartels, Sinaloa or Gulf cartel, I can't remember which, and then they became their own. I don't know, John, you could probably speak to that.
Well, the Zetas were trained by our special forces, and they branched off into a cartel.
Yeah, Pat. The Zetas originally were the enforcement crew for the Gulf cartel, and then they split and they moved into special operations. I think the reason the mercenaries play in here well, during the 60s through the 70s to the current day, there's always been the presence of mercenaries in Africa. And this time period, the Rhodesian Civil War or the Rhodesian Bush War ranged from 1964 to 1979. So it would be plausible that you would have some mercenaries get in there. And right now, the term of art has changed, but people talking about the crime-terror nexus or the crime-terror gang nexus. If you look at the Wagner Group, which, they're
in Russia.
Yes, the leader was Prigozhin, was just murdered probably by Russian state actors or proxies. Mercenaries still play in conflict, and they still cross over in that terror crime nexus. Places like Africa, which would have been hot then, are still hot now.
Yep.
I think the entire what we call hybrid threat or hybrid warfare includes nation states using criminal actors as proxies for their action. And obviously Russia, China, and Iran are commonly mentioned in that context. So I think that is realistic. It's, certainly the time frame of when that occurred would make great sense, because that was a notable, the Rhodesian Civil War was a notable use of mercenaries. There was a couple films about that. The Wild Geese.
The Wild Geese, yep. And that was a great movie. It's beyond my genre. I tend to focus on law enforcement crime, but that was a great one. But one of the things, Garber's having problems with these guys in the command center, and they're arguing back for it, and it got kind of physical there. But one of the lines, because this is, there's some comedic stuff to this movie, is what do they expect for, because he's saying, hey, I'm trying to save some hostages here. And he says, what do they expect for 35 cents to live forever? I thought that was a funny line. Obviously, people chuckled, and they're funny. You get on the trans system, there is a legal thread that the trans system has an obligation to provide a certain amount of security beyond that is provided by the city. It's a case law. I forget the name of.
It's common carrier liability.
There you go. Yeah. So it does exist. So for 35 cents, they do expect more, and they're supposed to get more, even though our frustrated boss just wants to get the train moving, right? And so yeah, it was. So I did. It was interesting because I like the history of the mercenaries, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's very interesting that a very few men were able to have such an impact. I think one of them, Denard, took over Cameroon or something like that. So they were able to take over nation states and lead it. That's how effective they are now. I think the UN and our nation states would suppress any of that now. They have to have a state-sponsored actor these days. But it's an interesting part of this movie. So the next thing is they want to deliver the money, and they have a couple cops that are going to deliver the money. And so I really kind of wanted to get into the practicality of this scene. So first they go through the mayor, who really is not interested in getting in the middle of this. He's in a tight election race. And I couldn't tell if are they presenting Lindsay there, or they're presenting the guy that followed him. And I can't remember the name of the mayor that followed Lindsay. Koch. Yeah, I think maybe they're trying to portray Koch there.
A Beam, I think he is. You're right. A Beam was then the Koch.
So who was the name of the guy after Lindsay?
Abraham Beam.
So is it Abraham Beam that they're trying to present in this thing? Did he just serve one term, or I'm trying to understand, because it seemed like he was in a tight race. I don't know if this was actual mirrored real life or not. I don't know that much about the mayoral politics at the time, but they didn't have any money, and he didn't want to pay $1 million. Seems small to New York now, but then it was a lot, right? Because they didn't have anything.
Yeah. Well, Beam was mayor from 1974 to 77, and then Ed Koch came in after that. So Beam was the mayor during the fiscal crisis. This movie's in 74. 73 would have been Lindsay. So this is kind of like the end of the Lindsay era going into Beam. Beam inherited a lot of the problems that started earlier under Lindsay. In fact, the breakdown of Lindsay in the early 70s was considered a contender for running for president. But the fiscal crisis and the disorder kind of derailed that.
Hey, John, didn't they see Lindsay as a potential next John F. Kennedy?
Yeah, I think he was certainly looked that way. He was
charisma.
He had charisma. He represented the Silk Stocking district in New York, where the money is in Manhattan, one of the most influential political districts in the country at the time. It's probably still to today. He was criticized heavily because of a lot of external factors. He did a lot of things to try to stimulate police reform, because police reform was at that time a critical thing. I know he wasn't liked by a lot of people because he was viewed as, he was a Republican, but he was a liberal Republican. The Republican Party has morphed a little bit since the time. He did a lot of good work, but I think what really killed him was the transit strike, and they had problems with the schools. The Board of Education, which later on got taken over, but was an independent agency controlled or influenced by the city, now has become a department of the city. I think his problem was it was a transition as the economy was falling apart, and New York got hit really hard with that fiscal crisis. So I think the character here is a melange of the two.
Yeah, we got an audience member says that a friend of his was killed as a mercenary in the 80s, which, it's a dangerous profession. I'm sorry, I cut you off, Ralph. Go ahead.
No, I said I agree with John. It was kind of merged of Lindsay, but it kind of looked like Beam and Koch put together, because the guy reminded me of Koch.
All right, talk about the practicality of taking the money by train at peak rush hour traffic to these guys. And one, I thought, after the car crash, they gave it to the motorcycle. Why didn't they give the motorcycle in the first place? But right, it's trying to move a car through traffic in Manhattan, I guess, because I don't know where the Federal Reserve is. Is it in Manhattan?
It's the
to
top
that area? Was that doable? Can you even do that in an hour?
Yeah, maybe you could, but I would have taken the FDR Drive and then came over. But rather than go surface streets. But I mean, you have to have artistic license.
Yes, I know.
Yes.
I figured since I had two guys from New York, I asked, well, what's the practicality of this? Because it's funny. We hired motors on the trans system just because they got around easier, to go to calls to buses and things like that, and it became one of the more popular assignments on the transit system. But it was very effective. I thought, why didn't they just give the money to the motorcycles in the first place? They would, But you're right. It's artistic license. We had to have the crash. We got to put pressure on it. Garber, of course, realized they don't know it's a crash, so he says, "Oh, the money's there. Now let's work on how to get there." Right. So he manages that scene. But you're saying it could be done, but probably wasn't the best way, and they just took a little artistic license. Would you say that's true, Ralph?
Yes, absolutely. But it made it exciting, and plus, let's face it, NYPD loves using their motors as escorts. I mean, they do. Wherever you go, I mean, they're going to escort, dignitaries. But it was a great scene, and actually, they would have got there safe if it wasn't for that young man on a bicycle with a cart on it that got in the way, and they had to swerve to the right and hit another cart and turn it over. But it made it exciting and kind of part of the whole tension of the movie.
All right, so I'm not from New York. I think you guys already answered this, but I got to ask one more question. Is there a Pelham line, John?
Well, no, Pelham's not a line. Pelham it's a terminal. It's a terminal on the northern end in the Bronx. Pelham Bay is in the Bronx. It's a terminus of the number 6 train, the Lexington Avenue line. So yes, there is a Pelham, and as they talk here, the convention they describe in the movie they would call the train based upon where it departed from and the time. So the 1, 2, 3 was at 1 p.m. and 23 minutes. So 1:23 p.m. And when it came back the other way, it would probably be like the Brooklyn Bridge, 2, 3, 4, or whatever time it would have left. But let me just jump one thing on the motors, because I think this is important, and it ties back to our experience in LA. You brought the motors into the transit.
It was actually Dan Finkelstein, okay. And I implemented, but it was Danny's plan.
But what we did later, and when I was the North Ops Lieutenant, we started putting patrol rifles on the motors as an experiment. And the reason we did that was because in congestion, if a terrorist attack occurs, there's going to be lots of traffic congestion. You're not going to be able to move. You're going to need to get there. And our concept of operation, the course of action that Matt Rodriguez and I developed, was getting urban patrol rifles, basically carbines, put onto the motors, because motors could get there quickly, contain an active shooter if there was, or even more important, get there and start the command and control. Get there, start doing the size up, doing the situation assessment, and then calling in additional resources that help to develop the response from the bottom up, rather than trying to run it from remote when you can't get there.
Well, and I think you had a supportive boss of that too, right, Dan? John, I think that was me, right? And I'm the one who had to convince everybody else. No, John's not crazy. This is right. The likely attack scenario is active shooter on a transit system, so he's absolutely right. This needs to happen, and so I think I came up with the money for it. But yeah, we had to convince SCB. Yeah, a lot of skeptical people on a lot of stuff that we did that was innovative and new for LA. Wasn't necessarily new for Israel, but it was definitely new for us. And lots of times I reached over to Israel and London and showed what they were doing. Well, if they're doing it, and why can't we do it, right? So, and even I think DC was a little more progressive than us. And I will say, John, the word isn't liberal Republican; it's progressive Republican. I think that's what they used to call themselves, in the vein of one of my heroes, Theodore Roosevelt, progressive Republicans.
Love
And,
Theodore. Love
Yeah,
Theodore.
Theodore. So,
Well,
and
except
a
for
great New Yorker.
John Lindsay ran on the Liberal Party in New York as well, a minor party. So he was a Republican, and at that time, what they called the Liberal Party in New York.
Oh,
So.
yeah. Oh, okay. All right. I stand corrected, but another great New Yorker. And I was visiting New York. I had since transitioned to anti-recidivism programs. They had me speaking there, and I went to St. Francis Tavern, right, to get something to eat.
Yeah, that's site of a bombing. It was a
Right. Well,
bombing.
George Washington said goodbye to his officers there after the Civil War. I learned that history, so I had to go have a drink. So they actually had me staying in Brooklyn. So as soon as I landed, I dumped off my bags. I jumped in an Uber. I went over there, and I had a beer and a sandwich there, and which was great because I wanted to be somewhere where George Washington had a drink, right? So I started to walk back to Brooklyn. I figured, well, I've been on a plane for several hours. And I walked to, I don't even know what river it was, but I was walking towards the Brooklyn Bridge, and I see this
East River.
The East River. I see this cafe, and it got a sign out here, and it said, Theodore Roosevelt used to drink here. I go, oh, well, I got in one day, I get to have something to eat and something to drink in places that were frequented by two different presidents that I liked.
Hey, Pat, the pub is McSorley's Pub, the oldest Irish pub in New York. And there's all pictures on the walls. You got to go there. It's a pictures of Theodore Roosevelt. Plus, Theodore Roosevelt lived on 21st Street.
Yeah.
Well, I stopped and I had a beer there and a dessert and then I said, okay, I had walked several miles, so I decided to take an Uber back to Brooklyn. But I always enjoyed my trips to New York. Let's get into our next scene, and it is I got to find my next scene here. Is I warned you. So during this. They got the hostages. They're working to get the money there, and somebody fires a shot, and they don't really even show who fired the shot. It's one of the they say it's one of the police officers, the snipers, fires a shot at Mr. Brown, and which I don't. It's pretty disciplined when you get the SWAT guys down there. That just doesn't happen, right? But it does happen in the movie. They do take a little bit of artistic light. There's a shooting back and forth, and this will give me a chance to talk about something I wanted to talk about. In terms of New York and the fact that they had conductors, right? They still had conductors. We didn't have really conductors. We had engineers, right? And they drove the train. But for the most part, you didn't have conductors on the system when I worked on transit. But did they still have conductors in your guys' day when you were younger that walked the train? And did they check fare? What was their primary job? We'll start with you, John, then we'll go to Ralph.
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. Back in that time, on the Staten Island Rapid Transit, which is now called the Staten Island Railway, conductors did walk the train and check fares and take fares. The same with Metro North and the Long Island Railroad. The New York City subway used turnstiles and tokens at that period of time.
Right.
And I remember the 35-cent token. That was the coin of the realm during the day. You would definitely see conductors on the train. New York still has conductors on the train. The person who drives the train in New York, they call a motorman.
Motorman.
My grandfather was a motorman on the IND, the Independent Subway. Used to do what they called back then the GG train, which is now called the G train. So you would have a motorman and a conductor. My grandfather would tell me back in the day, up until from the 40s and 50s, they would have what they called two conductors, a conductor and a rear guard, as well as a motorman, so a three-person crew. So they economized the cost, dropped it down to two, and that's still the state of the art for New York. The PATH still has a conductor and a motorman as well.
So when at the beginning of the movie, they show the conductor. I guess one guy's getting trained, right? They show him looking. Okay, you got to make sure everybody's on. You got to do this. So they did have so they were part of it was a safety issue, and they were a presence on the system, right?
Well, yeah, except for the conductors on the train were inside a closed box by this time to protect from the public, or from being interfered with.
Well, Ralph, do you remember conductors on the system yourself?
I remember conductors, and I also remember, I think it was Long Island Railroad too. I took, you would put your ticket on, it was on your seat. It was a little clip thing, John, you remember? And they
Yes.
just come in and punch it. But, I remember the motorman, I remember sitting up in front of the car, and I always wanted to jump into that door when it opened up just to look inside and stuff. But then there was always a person, a conductor walking up and just checking for, is everything moving in the right direction? Security, in a sense. Is everything peaceful? But sometimes it was kind of fun to see them yelling out at each other too. I'd look at the window, like remember when the one guy who gets killed later on, it was the conductor, and then the motorman looking at make sure everybody was checking was all right, and he was looking to see why Robert Shaw was talking to that guy, over there, the suspect. But yeah, I remember it, and I remember interacting with him as a kid, and they were just kind of personalities, of course, New York personalities, and I kind of enjoyed it. It was kind of fun interacting with them.
I bet you they looked out for the kids when you're on the train as well. But in this one, so the shooting starts and they shoot it out, and of course Robert Shaw says, if anything happens, I'm going to shoot a hostage. And of course, the first hostage he picks, or the hostage he picks to shoot, is the conductor, right? Trainee. Okay, and he makes him walk down the line, and just go and meet with these guys, and then he kills him, of course. Which we've seen in hostage situations. I want to emphasize my point, so I'm going to kill somebody. So this is it's not out of the ordinary, but so those are the conductors and radio men. They also get assaulted on these transit systems as well. So they're likely, they're the person you got to get through to get to everybody else. And I mean, I did a show on the Daniel Penny situation and Jordan Neely situation. And I'm really frustrated at how they're handling that in New York. I think Daniel Penny did what he thought was right, and they're charging him, and so I have a real frustration with that, particularly since they're not providing the necessary security, so that this guy didn't have to intervene, right? But in this scene, they do kill the conductor. They said, I warned you, and I think Garber says, yeah, you did warn me. John, well, first of all, I wanted to say we do have a comment from the audience member that Teddy Roosevelt was a police commissioner. He was. At the time, it was a collective group. It wasn't just one. And Teddy Roosevelt was a reformer, and he recommended that NYPD, that they start having an entrance exam. They didn't have that before that. So he was the first one that did that. And that would have been probably, John, help me out here, 1890s, maybe 1880s, something like that. That would have been before the turn of the century that he made those recommendations.
I agree.
Yeah. So, and he also went on to head up the Federal Civil Service Commission, where they implemented civil service to take the corruption and the spoil system out of the federal government, which also came to state and locals. And now we have civil service systems throughout our country. So he was a reformer. He recognized holding bureaucrats to a standard and giving people jobs, and getting the spoil system out of these systems also helped to remove corruption. I don't know if you guys want to speak on that, but
Teddy Roosevelt was a member of the Board of Police Commissioners from like 1895 to 1897. So right before the turn of the century, beginning the professionalization of NYPD. Before Roosevelt, NYPD was notable for corruption. There was a period of time when there were two contending police departments in New York City, the municipal police and what became the NYPD, and they would battle over which one would get to be the agency, and that reform was the start of removing that. Remember Tammany Hall was a corrupt machine political thing that ran from the 19th century right up until right about the time of this movie. I think Lindsay is the end of the Tammany Hall era in New York. Corruption was an issue in New York. It remains an issue in New York. It's obviously an issue in other places. Certainly Los Angeles, we just saw a former supervisor sentenced to 42 months in federal prison for
3 years.
3.5 years. Yeah.
So, corruption is a core issue. Corruption is a core issue in state failure. We talk tangentially about Mexico, and we'll talk about that again. But corruption is one of the tools for hybrid warfare that some of our adversaries use to weaken a state. So corruption is vitally important. controlling corruption is important. That's one of the underlying issues that I think we need to deal with. But I think one of the issues in LA, obviously New York has a call for more intense policing on the subway, and the NYPD transit guys do a great job. But here we have an issue where we need to, you're looking at crime on our transit system reaching a peak we've never seen before. And it's not necessarily related to the sprinkling to 3 different police departments as opposed to 1. But there's an attitude, as you mentioned earlier, on the board that maybe we don't need to have police. Maybe police, going back to, we talked about the broken windows and Jack Maple, who brought CompStat.
Jack Maple. Yep.
Jack Maple was a lieutenant. I think there's something about lieutenants. All 3 of us were lieutenants. So I take pride. But Jackie Maple was the real innovator of CompStat. Bratton learned that when he went to become chief of transit police. Everyone thinks of him as commander, but forget to say he was chief of transit police in the early 90s.
Well, he was the chief at MBTA as well, so in Boston, right? And so he I think he applied some of that there and brought it to New York, which is why he was picked, I think, as the chief in New York.
Pat, regards to this point in time when this movie was made, remember when NYPD, they had all the investigation of Serpico, the taking of the drugs that were supposed seized and was taken out of the the security or the storage house of the drugs and stuff. I mean, there was all that other stuff underlying going on with NYPD that, really affected policing because the public didn't trust it. And look at where, and it really, I got to tell you, it goes back to, I think every agency, it has to go back to how do we train our people and how much emphasis we put on teaching of ethics training. And I also not only ethics training for the new recruits, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, all the way up the line, that has to be continually impressed upon what it means to put that badge on and you take that oath of office. I think too many people forget about it. And I think we have to be reminded, because I'll tell you, if we don't recapture the fact that the public respects us, that we have to respect ourselves and really adhere to the policies and the oath of office, we're gonna have some more problems.
Well, I think, as John pointed out, your political class also have to hold themselves to a higher standard, and I think that clearly has not happened in LA. They've got 15 city council districts, and 4 of those, people have been indicted, and 3 of them convicted. And I wouldn't be surprised if Current Price, the latest guy that's indicted, gets convicted as well. So, I mean, they have some soul searching to do with the political class.
Exactly. Agree.
And, it's important that law enforcement hold themselves to a higher standard. But, it's really tough to say to a cop, hey, you gotta toe the line. That's an oath. And then they look at the people who essentially have oversight over them, who don't hold themselves to the same standard.
Yeah, but Pat, I don't mean to interject, but I feel very strongly about this. But we are the 24/7 people you could touch. These politicians, they don't go out in the street. I mean, they don't communicate the things that John did, you did, I did. The general public, the working class people, we smell it, feel it, taste it in the street, and they don't see that.
Right.
So I used to always teach when I was in the academy, you are everything rolled up in one. You are a psychologist, social worker, you're the doctor, you're giving first advice as in being that uniform. And I took that very seriously, and I used to impress upon that in my recruits, my trainees, every rank I went, I would talk about that.
I know that when we were, I always recognized, because I would go and sit in a bunch of different meetings in the transit system, and a lot of it was the construction of it. And I realized that the MTA in LA and probably in New York, it's a big pie of money, and the politicians are looking to carve a piece for themselves. They did not. I read Bratton's assessment of our transit policing, and it was negative, but it wasn't. It was designed for a reason. It was designed to take a piece away from the sheriff and give it back to LAPD. And somebody privately told me, no, it's not a reflection of you guys. This is all political. And it was when they divided it back up again and gave LAPD a chunk. It was a promise from Garcetti to the police union to get that, and because that came with money. as Danny Regalado throws out there $3 signs. It wasn't because of the competency. We did a good job in that transit system. It was all about money, and we held them off for, I want to say, 12 or 13 years, because ever since they lost it, they wanted it back and they couldn't get it. And we shut them down when I was the chief there for a while and actually increased our budget. But we got a new sheriff and he was a little asleep at the switch. And we lost it, right? But it was really all about money. It was not about competency. And so if you talk about corruption, did the people who make that decision get enriched by that? Yeah, I think they did. Did it personally benefit them in their pocket? I mean, because Garcetti went on to be the mayor. Now he's the ambassador to India. I don't know if that's a step up, but that's where he's at. So he got police support from the unions because he did something that wasn't necessarily, in my opinion, in the best interest of the riders. That's my personal opinion, and I'll challenge any LAPD officer to come on and argue that with me. But it is a big pie of money, right? It's a pot of money that's not necessarily part of the city budget, but you get to tap into because you get federal and state resources that come in, right, John? That's how those transit systems work.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing, and remember I mentioned I did my master's thesis on the consolidation of police departments in New York, and my conclusion in that study was both models, a dedicated transit police department or being under a municipal department, are viable and can work with the right leadership. We brought a thing together in LA that hadn't been done before, which was having a contract police agency work effectively become the dedicated in-house transit police agency, but under a contract on using the Lakewood model, which worked very well. But really, it goes back to the concept: where you stand depends upon where you sit.
Yes.
When Bill Bratton was chief of New York City Transit, he was a diehard, we need dedicated transit police. It's all department. When he became commissioner in New York, and same thing, chief in LA, it was like, we need the city police to do it.
Yeah.
So it's flexible. There's more than one way to do it. I think the common theme, you need to be responsive to the transit community. And the transit community is the riders, it's the people who work on the system, the train operators, the station agents, the maintenance display people, because they get victimized, right? I mean, I've been, unfortunately, to the funeral of a bus operator, right?
So we got a comment from Daniel Regalado. We did a great job as one provider. And I have to say, having seen transit systems around the country and overseas, one provider properly led is better than multiple providers. And I think Sid Hill said it to me. Hey, it's Napoleon said, I'd rather have one bad general than two good generals if I'm fighting a fight, because he realized there's going to be competing interests. I had never heard that. And of course, I heard it from the great and Sid Hill, a very smart guy. And so I think one provider is the way to go. I think bifurcating it so everybody gets a piece of the pie has only made it unsafe for our system.
I agree, but I think the common thing that we need to do, and Ralph has pointed this out many times, it becomes a training issue. But training isn't just for the cops, the sergeants, lieutenants, and the professionals that police it. Training, you need to train the executive board that runs the system to understand what transit cops actually do, because they look at it as an extraneous cost. They wouldn't like it.
We're second year. I always felt we were second-class citizens and we're a necessary evil. I got to move the show forward here a little bit, guys, but I wanted to say, they got their money now. They delivered the money. The cops managed to get there. They walk it down and they get the money. And now they're trying to get out there. So your guys' expertise on this. So they tell them, we want you to clear the line, give it all greens. And the terrorists actually get, I don't know why they didn't figure they would get off this system right away. So there's two things I really want to ask about. One, can they do this where everything's all green and the train is going out of control? Did they have systems that would break it then? And do they have that now? And the other thing is the dead man. I mean, a lot of this movie is built upon the belief that the conductor has to hold on to the handle or the controller for it to move forward. In this case, they developed a device. Is that fictional, John? That device explain that, and is it fictional and just a lot of fun, or was it real? Is there some truth to that?
It is not fictional. It is true, or at least at that time period. I don't know about the current rolling stock, but there was always a dead man switch. The controller that the motorman was, or the train operator in New York would drive the train with, you had to have constant contact. And that goes back to, there was a catastrophic train crash in 1918 on what they call Malbone Street in Brooklyn. The crash was so traumatic, they changed the name of Malbone Street to Empire Boulevard because it was a significant tragedy. So yes, the motorman at that period of time, and I haven't been on the subway in recent years, but at that period of time, that would have been true. And yes, they have the ability to control the signals. Back then, they would have had to do it manually. I don't know how far they progressed in automatic train control, but most systems are going to digital automatic train control. If you ran a red, it would trip it and stop the train. That's why that was a plausible plot point. And they would have, they constructed a device to do that in this scenario. I don't know how easy that would have been able to achieve then, but it certainly was realistic. The system at that time relied upon human controllers at towers at various points. I think a lot of that now is being replaced by more digital means. But we've had issues with automatic train control on commuter rail systems here, where they want to bring the ability to digitally control. I think one of the things that we're seeing now, which was certainly not plausible then, but we're starting to see cameras on board every train car, which are able to be exploited to provide command and control for critical incidents, but also provide a forensic record of what happened. That would not have been possible then, but now is kind of the state of the art.
Well, they're getting to the point. At the time when I was the chief, we couldn't watch the cameras in real time, which was a problem. We got another comment from Danny. We need cops who want to be transit cops. I absolutely agree with you, Danny. There is nothing wrong with spending your career in transit. You can do some really darn good police work, and it's more challenging in that environment because lots of times you're doing it on foot. So the dead man switch did occur, turning there. So we did have a train crash out here, John. That was a big part of my experience, and that was the Chatsworth train crash. But this involved a commuter rail line and a freight rail line, and they had, the transit line was supposed to weigh in on a siding and didn't, right? And blew past a red light, and that was depending on the conductor doing their job. And I won't get into all the details, but the freight rail and the transit engine crashed, and then we ended up I think it killed 25 dead, 45 seriously injured. So it was the worst train crash in California. But since that crash, they implemented a strategy called positive train control, or I think that's what it's called, that if you see two tracks on the line, one of them gets de-energized and they can't move forward. Do you know about this, and can you speak to that, John, at all?
Well, I know that they're developing those type of systems, and they're in progress, because commuter rail often runs along shared freight lines. That makes it a little more difficult. There's a cost to doing that, and the railroads are essentially, there's been a monopolistic consolidation of railroads, to achieve economic value. So that slows it down. The railroads also seek to contain costs so they can increase profit. So there's a need for regulation. The question is getting the balance between competition and regulation. But automatic train control is a key. I think having insight into how those systems work by transit cops is important. And the transit operators don't like cops to have, keys to the train. They want to, for their safety and bureaucratic integrity, I suspect, want to control all of that and don't want to necessarily cross-train cops into those functions. I think for the emergency services response, we need to build some of those capabilities. For example, New York City Transit Police had an emergency medical rescue unit. The Port Authority Police, the PATH unit, had an emergency unit. Those type of things, I think, need to be embedded within transit policing because of that unique environment. But it really comes down to making safety a key priority, having and safety and security are often viewed as separate. They need to be
Yeah.
viewed as complementary skill sets, and that the transit cops and the rail operations people need to work together to protect the community, right?
Yeah, well, it goes back to that. The cops were seen as, and security were seen as a liability or a cost, not necessarily a big part of the transit operation. And so, hey, let's get back to our movie. So
Could I make a comment, please?
go ahead.
Because Danny said something, and I believe what he's right, is uphold the transit policing, and I believe that the academy has to do a better job
Yes.
when they discuss about the different assignments within the sheriff's department. Just like we talk about patrol, how important it is, how we talk about custody, and we bring people in from custody, we brought people in from patrol. We need to bring people into the academy and talk to the young recruits who are going to be deputy sheriffs. The benefit of being a transit police officer and what you learn as being, what the little interest, the nuances you learn, how to be a cop, how to be a deputy sheriff, and how do you talk to people, because you may be the only person on that platform. You have to learn how to survive and talk your way out of something sometimes, instead of just going directly to force. How to use that command presence and those verbal skills.
You remember Danny Cruz, right? So he came to work for me, and he didn't really, and when he came to work, he loved it because he had grown up like you guys riding the trains in New York, and he thought he said, I can't think of a better. And a lot of guys, and Danny's one of them, who came to work the transit system. I see them every now and then. I don't see that many people anymore, but they say it was the best assignment they ever worked. And so when people come there and do the mission and do it the way we asked them to do it, one, they're successful, but two, they love it because you get to see the same people every day. That's the part of the fun of a transit system. If you're operating or working at the same station, it's going to be the same people coming on, the same people leaving. It's like being the beat cop where you're working that same beat over and over again. You get to see them all the time. And there's there's huge benefits to being in the transit system. You can work different assignments too, and be all over the county. I think it was 1,600 square miles was the transit system's jurisdiction. So it was really a good assignment. And a lot of the guys who really invested enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. It was a good part of my career, 10 years of my career. I did enjoy the terrorism part of it as well, and some of the investigative part of it as well. But to get back to our movie here, so they've overcome the dead man switch. They've got green lights. The train is going out of control. As John explained, when they do finally hit a red light, it is going to stop and it's going to slow down. And that was built into the system based upon this tragedy that John had talked about, right? To save people. And it was funny because the cops at first think, oh, we got to follow the train, right? And but in reality, they got off. And I would have thought that would have been the first thing that they would have thought of. They're going to get off and get this train moving, right? But they get off and they go back and they confront. Now these bad guys have some conflict, which kind of slows them down. I think it was Mr. Brown was somebody from the mafia. He wasn't really part of this guy's crew. He wasn't dependable. They end up having conflict and they end up shooting him. But we also have an off-duty cop on the train who gets off and engages these guys and shoots one of them as well. They end up shooting him. So we have the scene, and first Daniels, who is the inspector, and Garber are leaving. Then they decide to go back, and this is where Garber has his confrontation with these guys. So they overcome the dead man thing. The train is moving, and they decide to go back. And I would have thought that would have been the first thing, John. So I think obviously they're giving artistic license, but they did actually do the right thing. So what do you think of the scene here, John?
Well, I think it provides the context, the excitement you need to make a movie work. I think in real life, it may go a little different. I think in real life, the command staff to support this type of operation, even then, would have been larger. There would have been a group of people, probably like Jack Maple and others, lieutenants that knew those lines from the Transit Police District, the ESU guys, sitting down, problem solving, talking to the trained people, saying, okay, what could technically happen? How would we do that? So I think some of that is glossed over for, to make a plot point. But I think there would be real understanding beforehand of by the transit cops especially, of how the system worked, what its characteristics were. There would be a dialogue with the train people about what's the best way to understand this, what's the best way, to shuttle these people, right? I mean, they could have come up with a number of different ways, help route the train, slow the train. But that doesn't make a movie, right? I mean, the details. I mean, part of the problem we have in transit policing in specific and policing in general, and especially the counterterrorism side of it, is if we do our job right, and we mostly do, nobody sees the consequences of a bad day, right?
Yeah.
So they don't know what we put into understanding the system, how we, at least those of us that took command seriously, nurture our skills, learn our skills, train our personnel, and get the system together. But that doesn't make a movie, right? The movie needs excitement to drive the.
Yes. Well, the interesting part of the scene is at the end. So the off-duty cop shoots one of them. Garber and Daniels, they turn around, they each take, and Garber ends up confronting Shaw's character. I guess it's not Mr. Brown. I can't remember, Mr. Blue, and that's Robert Shaw's character, and Robert Shaw's about to execute the off-duty cop. And I want to get Ralph's comment in a minute here. But Robert Shaw, he doesn't want to go to prison, right? So let's talk about the third rail. There is a third rail on a subway system. We trained our guys to stay away from the third rail. It's clearly marked, but if you don't know the system, it could be very dangerous if you jump down in that pit and touch that third rail. Robert Shaw obviously had done his homework. One of the things I did on some research, when they were down in that subway system, they had to wear, the rats were out of control. They had to wear masks. It was really a dirty and dangerous system down there, including third rail. But he doesn't want to go to prison, so he puts his foot on that third rail, and that's pretty accurate. It would fry you fairly quickly, right, John?
Yeah, the third rail is a hazard. Obviously, you don't want to, touch it, have contact with it. A bird could land on the third rail, right? It's as long as it doesn't ground itself to the ground. When it grounds itself, if you could get both feet on there, theoretically, you'd probably be okay. I wouldn't try it. But what happens is you return the energy to ground and then you fry. One of the things is not just the third rail, though. It's one of the things we used to train cops here in LA specifically in the rail safety training, was that if the train derails and the train is off the track, the train could be energized. And if you touch the train, you could get the same effect. We have overhead catenary on part of our system.
The catenary, yeah.
Third rail on the the subway components, what they used to call the red line. They've renumbered them since I retired. But yeah, the third rail is real. It's a threat. The other threats equally to the cops working or people getting down into that transit environment are automated switches, right? The switches may move when you're not there, but you don't see the train. They're going to move beforehand and it could crush your feet. But yeah, that was what would happen if you were to persistently touch the third rail. You'd probably fry like that. I mean, this is the third time I watched the movie. I didn't remember that part until I saw it. But yeah, that's a threat. I mean, one of the things we need to do, and one of the things that amplifies the ability of terrorists to operate there, is the inherent hazards in the system. So we need to understand and model those.
Well, I want to talk about this scene. One more thing, Ralph. I want to get your comments on this, and I want to go right into the last scene, which would be busted. So, Bart, just roll right into that. So at the end of the scene, Mathau, he walks up to the off-duty cop who's got long hairs from the 70s. He's rolled onto his stomach. I mean, this is part of the comic thing, right? It's this guy. You clearly see it's a guy, and he looks down at. He goes, "Oh, okay, ma'am. Hey, we got an ambulance on the way. We'll get here." So he doesn't realize that this cop who's got this long hair is a guy. He thinks it's a woman, and so that's really a funny scene. And that is the reality. When we started doing undercovers, we got into the 60s and 70s to fit in. The undercover cops grew their hair long. That's not unusual. So hold your comment, because I want to roll into the next scene too. Early on in the movie, Mathau's talking on the radio, and he hears that one of these hijackers has a cough, right? But they start doing some grunt police work. what conductor in the last 10 years has been let go and might have a grudge? And they're just grinding out tips, right? All right, they're going through them all. They got their list. So Shaw's dead. We've already had. They've saved the day that they're going to tend to the police officer with the long hair. They got all the bad guys except for one who gets away with a big chunk of the money, and this is the motorman who's been released. And they're just doing, basic shoe leather police work, right? This is detective work. Hey, it makes common sense. Somebody's got to know how to operate the train, and it's not going to be some hijacker from mercenary from Africa. It's going to be somebody who actually worked the New York subway system. And so they look for a motorman, and they start going through their list, which is so. Speak to the scene about the long hair with the undercover, and then speak to the gumshoe work that they did that actually led to.
Thank you. The thing about that was because the preceding scenes, they said, we're not sure if it was a guy or a girl. And then even with the black woman who worked with Kaz, and he used to complain about women being inside the, railway. So, Mathau's already got this in his head. And he puts his arm on, okay, man, don't worry about it. We're going to get the ambulance for you. Take care. So it all rolls back into the humor, and also using Walter Matthau as an actor who has got a great sense of humor, and it's really dry. Now, the part I thought was great to show that with Rico and him getting together and say, hey, let's look into all the people that were fired or dismissed or discharged. I thought that was great. And I also thought it was great that all the tension, just think of all the tension and reality of what Mathau's on the mic talking to the leader, Robert Shaw, and he kept on hearing somebody sneezing, Gesundheit, right? And then here he is ready to leave the place. And there's a great look on him. And then, Martin Balsam thinks, okay, I fooled these guys. He sneezes before Mathau could close the door, and he sees those, and that look, he goes like, I got you, more or less.
Yeah.
And that was a great closing. You didn't need to say anything more than that, but it was also great police work and follow-up about Rico and Garber following up on it. And obviously it must have taken much longer than that, but they had to speed it up. But, I just thought they did a great job on that. And I just believe it was just a great, gritty movie that, because we know we're coming to a close, a great, gritty movie to show New York. And the way I remember New York as a youngster and as a teenager and then a young adult at 22 when I left, So I just think it's an outstanding movie.
Well, when I was reading up on this movie, the folks in New York were at first reticent to do the movie. The mayor pushed them because they got tired. They had the movie Serpico had come out. They had the movie Death Wish had come out, and it was portraying New York in a really negative light. And they were really concerned about this movie. But this movie had just a comic touch to it. It as you said, it showed New York as being gritty, but it also showed a fun part of New York. I mean, we're down on our heels, but we can laugh at ourselves. Is kind of how I thought about it. And this actually got, I think, from Rotten Tomatoes, got 100%. I mean, it's got a really high review. The people love the show. And John, I'll let you finish up with the final thoughts on. I'll let you both finish up with some thoughts on that. But it really did end up presenting New York in a positive light, even though it was gritty crime drama.
Yeah, Pat, I agree. It was a great movie. In retrospect, it probably influenced my, path into transit policing even here in LA. So great movie. I think the one thing I'll point out, I think the plainclothes cop on the train wasn't off duty. I think he was part of a plainclothes team. And that would have been what they called back in the day on the transit police department an anti-crime unit. An anti-crime is an effective tool. There are some people that want to do all cops anti-crime because we'll catch the criminal, but there's no preventive nature there. Yeah. That's why you need to use anti-crime together with your uniform presence. And if you synchronize the both, you can do some really good crime fighting on the system. I think the real takeaway I'd say here, this shows that a terrorist or quasi-terrorist type attack on board a transit system is a real threat, and there historically have been a number of attacks. I think this shows the preference toward a hijacking attack, which was more common in the 70s than it is now. We've seen, active shooters and suicide bombings raised to the level, but bombings have always been a part of the repertoire, which tells me that if we're policing the transit system, you need to have the ability of what I call full spectrum policing, go from community policing, get out there, talk to the public, talk to the riders, talk to the transit employees, and address the criminal situation when disorder comes in. For example, we've had issues with, riots impacting the transit systems in LA. You need to have that capability, and then you need to have the anti-terrorism, counterterrorism capability should an attack occur. I think the plot point of the two lieutenants going out to do the door knock worked really well for the movie. I suspect in real life we'd have a team of detectives working in the operations section, doing that much sooner and hitting those people. But automated systems now and police practice has matured a bit since the 70s. But I think wonderful movie. Makes me want to go back to New York. It's a shame you can't put the front window down on the subway cars the way we did back in the 70s. I used to be my preferred spot on the train, get up to the front window, drop it down, and feel that subway wind the train goes through. Because back then they didn't have air-conditioned trains, or they had very few air-conditioned trains, right? So that was always fun. But,
so Ralph, positive, gritty crime drama, but ultimately shows New York in a positive. We're dealing with our negativity, and we're dealing with our problems, but we're doing it with a chuckle, a smile, and a little bit of fun. What do you think?
Yeah, resilient.
Absolutely. I just love the fact that it portrays New York with a certain New York humor that you don't get anywhere, And I want to say this also, Pat, this format, I wish they would use sometimes a movie in the Academy to talk about what took place in the past, what is right now, to be able to train and educate how you talk to people, good and bad, how do you use humor, to be able to accomplish a mission. You're talking about a little guy that when I worked Men's Central Jail 2200 module, everybody was bigger than me, but I used my humor, my New York mannerisms, my New York tone to be able to get information and stuff. And I think we have to go use some of these things as what you're doing right here to show the Academy, whatever movie it is, points of interest and learning. I mean, I sat here today, I learned a lot from John today because I didn't work transit. I learned from you, Pat. I never worked transit. But the bottom line was I could have worked anywhere because I knew how to talk to people.
Yep.
And that's what it comes down to. Connect those dots, a relationship with people. To have a relationship plus trust equates to effectiveness. So I thank you for that.
All right, well, stick around for a debrief. I got to say goodbye to our audience. So, hey, you can catch us on every Tuesday at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on Pop Culture Minefield YouTube, but you can also catch us on Rumble, Pop Culture Minefield. Remember to follow us on Rumble, like the show, make a comment on YouTube. You subscribe, like, and make a comment as well. Martin, it's been a great show, and you can take it away.
Those sons of bitches.
Ma, I'm doing a show!